Please welcome Nir. Hey.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to be talking today about how products change our behavior. And in particular, we know that these little gadgets that we're carrying around with us all day, every day, have a profound impact. We've all noticed in our day-to-day lives how these gadgets and all the services within them change our day-to-day behavior. So what we're going to do today for the next few minutes is to start looking for some patterns. My research over the past several years in the context of the class I teach at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford has been around looking at how products form habits. And so we're going to depart just from the healthcare industry for a few minutes, and we're going to look bigger. We're going to look outside this industry to identify why some of the most habit-forming products in the world are so good at changing people's day-to-day lives. So let's start with a quick definition of what habits are. Habits, very simply, are these impulses to do these behaviors with little or no conscious thought. And so when I talk about which companies do we think of that are amazingly good at this, the companies that over the past few years have changed people's day-to-day behaviors, I'm talking about the tech companies like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and Snapchat, these companies in the consumer tech world that get people to do these rather unusual behaviors, if you think about it, behaviors that were not part of their day-to-day lives, and yet somehow not only do they change people's behavior profoundly, but they do it so quickly, right? The span of a few short years. Millions, if not billions of people for some of these companies are using these products and have these day-to-day habits. So I compiled my research into this book called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And the core of the book is this model called the hook model. And we find these hooks in all sorts of habit-forming experiences. What a hook is, the definition of a hook, is an experience designed to connect your user's problem to your solution with enough frequency to form a habit. And these hooks have these four basic elements, these four basic steps that we see repeated time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming experiences that if your product does not exhibit, you will have a very difficult time forming a long-term habit. And these four steps, these four phases, are a trigger, an action, a reward, and an investment. So let me walk you through these four basic steps. Starts out with a trigger. A trigger is a cue to action. It's something that prompts the user to do the habit. And we have two types of triggers. We have external triggers and we have internal triggers. Now, external triggers you'll be very familiar with. These are things in our environment that tell us what to do next, where the information is in the trigger itself. So click here, buy now, watch this video, a police officer in traffic telling you which way to go, a friend telling you about an application that you should really try out, a great new app, all examples of external triggers. We know all about external triggers. We use them. It's part of our craft, our trade, to build these external triggers. But what I find many product people don't think about enough, and what turns out to be absolutely critical for forming these long-term habits, are associations with these internal triggers. Internal triggers are things that prompt the next action, but the information for what to do next, unlike in the case of the external trigger where it's in the trigger, in this case, the information for what to do next is informed through an association in the user's mind. So what people do in response to being in a certain situation, a certain routine, a certain place, and most frequently in response to certain emotions, dictates what they do next, dictates their automatic behavior that they do with little or no conscious thought. And when it comes to emotions, not just any emotions, I'm referencing specifically negative emotions. So what we do in response to feeling bored or lonesome or indecisive or lost or dissatisfied, what we do in response to these emotions, these pain points, dictates what we do next. In fact, some of the research that shows this is the case comes to us from a study that showed that people with depression check email more. Maybe some of you have seen this study, that people with depression check email more. Now, why would that be? The theory is that people suffering from clinical depression experience what psychologists call negative valence states. They feel down more frequently than the general population. And so what are they doing to boost their mood, to get out of that negative valence state? They're turning to their technologies. And of course, we do this all the time. Let me ask you a few questions. What website do we turn to? Where do people go when they're feeling lonely? What website? What service? Facebook, of course. And what about when we're feeling unsure about pretty much anything? Before we scan our brains to see if we know the answer, what do? We Google it, of course. And what about when we're feeling bored? You know, between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't feel like working on. Where do you go? You go to YouTube. You check stock prices, sports scores, Pinterest, fashion magazines, television. Lots of solutions for this painful internal trigger of boredom. We don't like these negative emotions. They feel bad, and we seek to escape those negative valence states. So what do we do with this? It's a bit of pop psychology. I see some of you kind of shifting in your seats and saying, yeah, I guess I kind of do use these services when I'm feeling these emotions. But how do we build better? How do we make better products and services to help people live happier, healthier, more connected lives, knowing this information about the importance of internal triggers? Well, it starts from fundamentally understanding your user's itch. If you don't understand what internal trigger you are creating an association with, it's going to be very hard to create that behavior done with little or no conscious thought. So that's a very brief introduction to triggers. Let's move on to the next step of the hook, the action phase. The action phase of the hook is defined as the simplest behavior done in anticipation of a reward. The simplest behavior done in anticipation of reward. Let me show you some examples of some habit-forming products and how simple their action phases are. For example, scrolling on Pinterest. Anybody here use Pinterest, by the way? Very, very popular site. They're doing unbelievably well. So just that action of scrolling on Pinterest, or searching on Google, or hitting the play button on YouTube. Incredibly simple actions done in anticipation of a reward. And it turns out that there's actually a formula for predicting these singular behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. How many of you have seen this before? Okay. Oh, not as many as I would have expected. So everybody should know this formula. B equals MAT. It comes from a researcher by the name of B.J. Fogg at Stanford. And Fogg tells us that for every human behavior, offline, online, doesn't matter, we need these 3 fundamental elements. That behavior equals motivation, ability is how easy or difficult something is, and a trigger. We just talked about triggers. So for any human behavior, we have to have these 3 basic elements for a singular behavior to occur. Let's talk about these 3 real quick. Motivation, according to Edward Deci, the father of self-determination theory, is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. Now, psychologists have been arguing about the nature of motivation for decades and decades, but Fogg gives us these 6 basic levers that we can pull on to increase a behavior by boosting motivation. Because fundamentally, all of us as human beings, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain, we seek hope and avoid fear, we seek social acceptance, and we avoid social rejection. So every bit of marketing copy, every commercial, every billboard you've ever seen fundamentally uses one or more of these 6 levers of motivation. There's a lot more to be said about that, but for the sake of time, let's move on to the second part of B equals MAT, ability. Ability is the capacity to do a particular action, how easy or difficult something is to do. And here again, we have these 6 factors, these 6 levers that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur based on how much time it takes, how much money something costs, how much physical effort is required. Brain cycles. This is a big one when it comes to digital products, because it turns out the more difficult something is to understand, the less likely that behavior is to occur. Social deviance tells us that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it. And then finally, non-routine has to do with the fact that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it in the past. And this is why habits are so important. Habits have a repeater effect, because the more I do something, the easier it becomes, therefore the more likely I am to do it in the future. What do we call that? It's called practice, right? The more we do it, the easier it becomes, the more likely I am to do it in the future. So Fogg puts together these 3 factors of motivation, ability, and triggers inside this graph that I think is actually really useful in a product development context. If you're asking yourself, you know, we built this beautiful product, it's so slick, so sexy, it's so great, but users aren't doing what we've designed them to do. Why not? Well, you can ask yourself, Does the user have sufficient motivation? High motivation is at the top, low motivation is at the bottom. Does the user have sufficient ability? If something is easy to do, it's over here. If something is difficult to do, it's over there. And if they have sufficient motivation and sufficient ability, they cross this threshold. And if the trigger is present, the behavior occurs every single time. Offline, online, doesn't matter. So let's do a quick pop quiz here. I want you to think of the last time that a phone rang in your life and you did not pick up the phone. Give me a reason. Shout it out. Why didn't you pick up the phone? Didn't know who was calling. Maybe it was a telemarketer, or maybe you just knew who was calling, but you didn't want to pick it up. That would be an example of low motivation. Okay, low motivation. Even if the phone was right there next to you, high ability, and you heard the phone ring, the trigger was present, you didn't pick up the phone. Low motivation. What's another reason? What's another reason? It has to do with ability or trigger. You're in the bathroom, or you're in the shower, or you're listening to my talk, and it's difficult. It's physically, you got to leave the room and pick up the phone. It's hard to do. So that would be an example of low ability, even if you wanted to pick up the call and even if you heard the phone ring. What's another example of a reason you might not pick up the phone because of a trigger? Exactly, it's on silent. So if the phone's on silent, even if you wanted to pick it up, and even if that behavior is really easy to do, the phone is right there next to you, if you didn't hear it ring, if there was no trigger, you will not pick up the phone, right? How many of the customers and the users that you're catering to want to do the behavior is easy to do, but for whatever reason, you're not properly triggering them? We have to have all three every single time: sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger. And with this tool, you can ask yourself what's missing, what's not there for the user to prevent them from taking this particular action. The next step of the hook model is the reward phase. Now, the reward, when we talk about rewards, we have to start in the brain. And in particular, an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, the nucleus accumbens was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner. And Olds and Milner found that this particular part of the brain had some very unusual properties. That when they allowed lab animals to self-stimulate this part of the brain, they implanted these tiny electrodes that sent an electrical current to this part of the brain, and they let the lab animals press a little button, a little lever, to stimulate this part of the brain. What they observed was that the animals did this obsessively. They wouldn't stop. They would forgo food, water. They would run across painful electrified grids just to continue to stimulate this part of the brain. In later experiments on people, they observed similar results. That some people had to have these machines forcibly removed to get them to stop pressing these buttons. But it turns out that you don't need electrodes to stimulate this part of the brain. All kinds of things activate your nucleus accumbens every single day. Things like luxury goods, sex, junk food, certain chemicals, and of course, right there in the center, technology products. All of these things activate this part of the brain every day. Now, Olds and Milner and much of the psychology community believe that the purpose of the nucleus accumbens was to stimulate pleasure. Right? Why else would lab animals and later people incessantly click on these buttons to activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. What we now know is that the nucleus accumbens doesn't activate pleasure per se. It activates what we call the stress of desire. Wanting, craving, anticipation. This is what activates this part of the brain and prompts us to action. And it turns out that there is a way to stimulate this itch that we seek to scratch, this craving, this desire. Does anybody want to know how to supercharge that response? Anybody curious? I'm doing it to you right now. Because the unknown is fascinating. So when I took that little bit of a pause and I asked you a question, and I did something a little bit different in my cadence, some of you perked up. What's he going to do next? And it turns out that that bit of variability causes us to increase focus, increase engagement, it captures our attention, and it won't let go. And of course, some of the classic research for this comes out of the work of B.F. Skinner. Many of you remember Skinner from your Psych 101 class, the father of operant conditioning. Skinner's famous experiments where he put his pigeons inside a little box, gave them a lever to press on, and at first, when they would press the lever, they would get a reward. They would get a little food pellet. And so basically, the pigeons would press on the lever whenever they were hungry. But then Skinner did something a little bit different. Skinner introduced a variable reward, an intermittent reinforcement. So sometimes the pigeons would click on the lever, nothing would happen. The next time the pigeon would click on the lever, they would receive a reward. And what Skinner observed was that the rate of response, the number of times the pigeons clicked on the lever, increased. The behavior was observed to happen more frequently when the reward was given on a variable basis. Because what we now know is that variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, stimulating this wanting, this craving, this desire response. And so in all sorts of products that you find most engaging, the ones that capture our attention and won't let go, the ones that are the most habit-forming, you will find one or more of these variable reward types. Rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. So let's talk about these briefly. Rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that come from other people, and of course come on this variable basis. So for example, the search for empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good. Competition, partnerships, cooperation, all of these things feel good, come from other people, and are a little bit variable. There's a bit of mystery. So the best example I can think of online is social media, right? We're on a site like Facebook. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to get. When I open my news feed, what pictures might I see? How many people commented? What do they say? How many likes did something get? High degree of social variability. Next is rewards of the hunt, the search for resources. So the rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other resources. And of course, in modern society, these things are bought with money. So when many people think about intermittent reinforcement, variable rewards, they think about gambling, right? They think about slot machines, where these slot machines have this variability about what you might win when you play with them, when you play a slot machine. But it turns out that we see a very similar phenomenon with information rewards. That information rewards are also a reward of the hunt. So let's take the feed, for example. Why is the feed so popular today? Why does every tech product seem to have this feed mechanic? You ever think about that? Well, let's look at Twitter's feed. OK, well, that's not very interesting. That's not very interesting. Well, but that's interesting. So what do I need to do to get more rewards, to get more of these information rewards? What do I have to do? I just got to scroll. Exactly. So this scrolling becomes very similar to pulling on a slot machine. Same idea. Variable rewards of the hunt around these information rewards. Finally is the search for self-achievement, rewards of the self. Rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have an element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about these information or material rewards. These are things that are intrinsically motivating. They feel good in and of themselves. The search for mastery, consistency, competency, control, all examples of rewards of the self. So for example, in gameplay, right? When I'm playing a game, even if I'm playing all by myself, getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement would be an example of rewards of the self. And if you say to yourself, you know what, I'm not much of a gamer, I don't really play games myself, I bet you play this game every day. This look familiar? Checking those unread messages, clearing your inbox or your to-do list for the day, checking those things off so that you can get them off your plate so that you can control them, master them, or checking a notification because it just bugs you that that little icon is telling you to do something. That would be an example of rewards of the self, the search for mastery, consistency, control, competency. Okay? The whole point of this variable rewards phase, why products use these variable rewards, is because it's about scratching the user's itch. It's about giving the user what they came for, satisfying that pain point, and yet leaving the user wanting more. Some bit of mystery involved with what they might find the next time they engage with that product. So that brings me to the last step of the hook model, the investment phase. And this is the phase of the hook that I think most of the time companies neglect and where I think there's the greatest opportunity for growth. The investment phase is where the user puts something into the product for a future benefit. It's not about immediate gratification. It's about a future reward. And investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook in two ways. The first way is that investments load the next trigger. They load the next trigger. Let me show you an example. So when I send someone a message on WhatsApp, for example, when I send someone a message, there's no immediate gratification. I don't get points. I don't get badges. Nothing really happens when I do that. But when I send someone a message, when I use the platform, when I invest in the platform to send someone a message, I'm very likely to get one of these, a reply. And that reply is an example of an external trigger that brings me through the hook once again. Okay? So the investment loads the next trigger. The second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass is by storing value. One of the reasons I love living in Silicon Valley and I love working in the technology industry is because unlike things in the physical world, things made of atoms like these chairs, your phones, or everything in the physical world, these type of things in the physical world depreciate with use, right? With wear and tear, they lose value. But habit-forming technologies should appreciate with use. They should get better. They should get more valuable the more they're used because of this principle of stored value. So the more content I put into iTunes, the better it becomes as my one and only music library. The more data I give to a personal finance site like Mint.com or using Pinterest, for example, the more data I give a service like that, the better the site becomes for me. I can do more with the product the more data I give that service. Followers, the more followers I have on a site like Twitter, for example, the better the product becomes for me. It becomes a better medium for me to reach my audience. So if Twitter were to send out a message tomorrow that says, we're shutting down Twitter unless you pay us, who's more likely to send them a check? Someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they've stored all this value in the site. And finally, reputation. Reputation is a form of stored value that users can literally take to the bank. Because what I can charge for my goods and services on TaskRabbit or eBay or Airbnb is determined by my reputation score. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms after I've spent all this time storing this value in the form of reputation? Pretty unlikely. Kind of hard to leave. So that's it. That's the basis of the hook model, these patterns that we see repeated time and time again in all sorts of habit-forming technologies, which over time, through successive cycles through these hooks, this is how customer attitudes are changed, how preferences are shaped, and how habits are formed. So I have to apologize because that was a lot of information. Usually I teach this class in about 3 weeks, and it's a 250-page book, and I condensed it to about 20 minutes. So I apologize. I know that was a lot of information. There's more in the book and on my blog, nirandfar.com. But here's the most important slide. This is what I want to leave you with. That if you're building a technology, a business that requires habits, if you have to have a habit in order to be a viable business, meaning you have to have unprompted user engagement, if you want to test whether your business meets the criteria of forming a habit, you need to be able to answer these 5 questions. Number 1, what's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? What's the itch? Number 2, what's the external trigger that brings the user to the product? Number 3, what's the action, the simplest behavior that is done in anticipation of a reward? Number 4, is the reward fulfilling and yet leaves the user wanting more? And then finally, what's the bit of work done to increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook? Before I go, there's one more thing I'd like to mention, which is the morality of manipulation. That many times when I teach this content, when I teach about how companies are changing our day-to-day behavior, some people kind of scratch their head and say, is this kosher? Like, is this OK to use people's psychology to make them do all these different things? Well, I think that is a good response. I'm glad if you had that reaction. Because let's face it, what we're doing here, whenever we're changing human behavior to meet our ends, can benefit the user too, but when it meets our ends as well, that is a form of manipulation. And we need to be very thoughtful about how we use the psychology of habit design for good. Because if we're not careful, the products that we use, remember, what we're building out in Silicon Valley, these are the kind of products that people take with them to bed every night. It's the first thing they reach for in the morning before they even say hello to their loved ones. And as Ian Bogo said, it's quite possible that technology is becoming the cigarettes of this century. So we have a very special responsibility as product designers, as investors, as engineers. We have a very special responsibility to use the psychology of habit design for good. So what I encourage you to do, and this is not a very big ask for a crowd like this working in health, is to fix one of the world's problems. You know, there's so many problems to fix. I encourage you to use the psychology of habit design to help people live happier, healthier, more connected, richer lives, and to borrow from the words of Gandhi, to build the change that you wish to see in the world. Thank you very much. Very quick ask. Many times I get asked for the slides for my presentation, so I want to give that to you immediately. That's kind of the reward. Here's what I need you to do. Everybody have a phone or something connected to the internet? Raise it up for me. All right, fantastic. I made the action very easy. Here's what I want you to do. Just go to this URL, opinion2.us. There's a very short survey. It's only 5 questions, just a bunch of radio buttons. Would love to know what you thought of the presentation. I'm constantly tweaking it and improving it, so would love to know what you thought. As soon as you click submit, you will be taken to my SlideShare page where you can have all the slides you just saw. And with that, thank you very much.
Beautiful, thanks.